So my part of the history of Intaglio presentation is going to cover the 16th century and the work of Albrecht Dürer. So Dürer was a German artist and Renaissance man born in the city of Nuremberg in May of 1471. He distinguished himself pretty early on in his 20s, predominantly because of his Gothic style woodcut designs, which were far better than others made by artists his age or even established artists of the time. But woodcuts weren't the only medium in which Dürer excelled. He did much of his best work through dry point engraving, as well as trying some etching work later on for a brief period of time. He spent most of his youth studying and communicating with major Italian artists of the time in order to absorb some of their knowledge and fascination with classical works of art, as well as with northern artists who were exploring the effects of light and shadow within the fine arts. One of the artists he corresponded with many times and indeed shared work with was a Mantuan artist by the name of Andrea Mantegna. So Mantegna was a painter and engraver whose works mainly drew reference from traditional classical sculpture, which was mostly Greco-Roman examples at this time. So one such example is his piece, The Battle of the Sea Gods, which was an engraving made in 1493. This piece heavily references classical Greco-Roman modes of art, which emphasize naturalistic depictions of a mostly idealized, usually muscular human figure who is positioned within a tight, most often hierarchically ordered composition. So this piece was, in a sense, copied by Dürer a year later, except it wasn't a direct copy of the original, and instead Dürer chose to add his own subtle tweaks and adjustments that align more with the conventions of art produced in the north of Europe rather than the south. So the first and most obvious difference is that Dürer recreated the Battle of the Sea Gods as a pen drawing, while the original was an engraving. Next, and more subtly, Dürer simplified the background and removed some of the objects and detail in the foreground. So this more clean and newly recognizable space can be seen at the feet of the figures as well as in between and behind them. Next, Dürer more accurately produced anatomical proportions of the figures and was able to model them more realistically to look a bit leaner as compared to the huge muscle-bound figures of Mantegna's engraving. So the more rounded and softer representation of the figures is the result of both Dürer's emphasis on their anatomical accuracy, but it was also a result of the medium itself. So pen drawings allow for, I think, much more subtle texture, as the pressure of the pen can vary a lot, whereas the amount of pressure that an engraving requires has to be a bit more uniform and consistent. So this difference in texture opportunity is much more obvious in Dürer's pen drawing, and as a result there's a little bit more subtle contrast and differences in certain places when compared with the original. So this is the original engraving, Mantegna's original engraving. So this is the one where the figures will be a lot more muscular, a lot closer to the Greco-Roman figures. So in and around here you can see they're just much bigger. And then this space, the foreground up here, is much more complicated, as you'll see when I switch it to the next picture. So this is Dürer's piece. This is the pen drawing that he recreated. So this has the simplified background. It's a bit cleaner in the foreground. The figures, their muscles, are a bit more rounded. They look a bit more natural. They don't look like huge muscular guys. They look more like leaner, regular people. And the expressions on their faces are a bit more intense, and they just look a bit more serious, which was, again, aligning with northern conventions rather than southern conventions coming out of Italy during the time. So inspiration from correspondents in the north of Europe, such as Martin Schongauer and the Hauptbuchmaster, gave Dürer a foundation of knowledge from which he drew information that allowed him to begin to incorporate more complex meanings into his creative process. So it was also the way in which he designed and composed his pieces that led to praise for both his technique and the idea behind it. So the combination of technical skill and thoughtful idea that Dürer was capable of is exemplified in a piece titled Night, Death, and the Devil, which was an engraving he made in 1513. This piece depicts a symbolic representation of Christianity through the use of the knight, who travels seemingly unbothered through a dark forest filled with monsters of various forms, while being followed by a skeletal figure meant to represent a form taken by the devil, and an inscription from Erasmus translating to "Look not behind thee" is referenced as sort of like background information for the piece. So this is meant to invoke feelings of like dread and dreariness, which can be reinforced by like the multitude of cross-hatching and dot patterns, which as a whole absorb a lot of ink and they make the piece really dark. There's also a variation in the stroke direction that he used, which was accomplished by alternatively rotating the surface, so like the plate and the needle, so it changed the orientation of the scratch marks he left, so they're in like different directions. It's basically just implying that he was able to add like deeper, darker tones with his texturing. So this piece also explores the importance of trust in one's faith, as the knight is like kind of hounded by these figures and themes of death. He still like moves forward and he doesn't look back, which translates in a religious sense to the concept of blind faith, but in a good way, like blindly following a hopefully benevolent God that'll lead him somewhere better than he is right now. It also enforces feelings of virtue and an upstanding moral conscience, as again the knight is exercising his steadfast faith in his religion, as he could fight the creatures around him, but instead pursues his mission, which is probably religious in intent. So here you can see like the cross-hatching that just creates a really, really dark area in and around the horse and the knight himself. And you can see in like the hind quarter of the horse, I don't know if it's too obvious, but there's different directions that the scratches are going, so it's creating a different texture pattern. In more so opposition to like the overwhelming darkness that is like closing in around the night in Night, Death, and the Devil, Dürer created a much larger and more open and most importantly light area around the titular character in his piece St. Jerome in His Study, which was created in 1514. St. Jerome in His Study depicts an old man sitting inside a small but relatively cozy room that's illuminated through sun streaming through large windows to his right, while a sleeping lion is lying in front of his desk on the floor. The line work within this piece is almost just as intricate as the last piece, but it's used for a different purpose this time. This time it's used to construct more so like linear perspective, so to imply a sense of depth and more believable perspective than any of his last pieces, which you'll see when I pull it up in a second. But also like the last piece, there's variation in stroke size, which again helps flesh out more of the finer details in the piece, such as like the hair on the lion lying up here. The texture of the stained windows too, and around here that are letting in light, and then the grain of the wood along the ceiling are all examples of like pretty fine line work that he used to create different textures throughout the piece, while also using the line work to make a really believable area that you feel like you could almost walk into. Next, following this, after producing his last piece, Dürer began to experiment with etching, which was in essence, he hoped to get rid of like the immense amount of time he would spend inscribing thousands of tiny little lines onto a plate in order to create texture, and instead he relied on the reaction of acid and metal to etch a texture or pattern into the surface of that plate, which would permanently create a different texture across like a big surface once the plate was exposed to acid. So the most complex etching Dürer produced is titled The Canon, and it was made in 1518, and it shows much more of a conscious emphasis on intentionally spacing various textures, which was made possible by etching rather than graving, of course. So there's different textures in the mountains, there's different textures in the sky, in the structures in the foreground, and the grass in the foreground, which are all pretty broad areas. So again, he would have done that by etching rather than engraving. Unfortunately, he didn't find much success with this medium. He found that the plates upon which he did these etchings tended to corrode pretty quickly, and like the fine detail he could bring out in an engraving couldn't really be brought out in an etching. So he didn't do too many of these. So following this, he chose to focus more on portraits as he grew older. So the special attention that he paid to his line work and the importance to texture for him was especially apparent in these portraits. Again, he would use like thousands of tiny lines to create like more natural facial expressions that actually looked like really realistic for the time. So his portrait of his friend, named and consequently titled Willibald Pirkheimer, is a perfect example of his use of delicate line work in order to create a very human and sensitive picture. So the attention paid to light and shadow in and around the face and the body of the subject, as you'll see. The representation and the texture of the fur that the subject's wearing. Here's the light and shadow playing across the body and face of the subject. And the way in which the subject's hair kind of absorbs and deflects light are all examples of how his line work and the understanding of light and shadow kind of allowed for like unparalleled realism in his portraits. That wasn't really being seen in engravings by any other artist during this time. And it was pretty much like his uncanny depiction of physical characteristics in a naturalistic way that kind of set him apart from the other engravers in Europe working during this time. But yeah, that's all I have.